jump to your module directory, and in the steps folder, go ahead and open up the second one, which is called Loading jQuery After Page Load. Go ahead and copy the code and paste it over the code that's currently in your interact.js file and save it. Okay, we'll see the code that we had before here. This is identical code, but we've wrapped it in a new statement that uses the jQuery object. And what we're doing is passing it the document object. Now notice below we used a selector, whereas here we're passing it a direct object. And then we're running the ready method on it. And this will check to see if the DOM, or all of the content inside of this object, has been loaded. Because document includes the entire page, we can check this to make sure that it's loaded before running any code and know that if we're acting on any content in the page, that it's ready for us when we execute our code. Now we're passing a parameter to this ready method, but the parameter is actually a function. And if you haven't seen this before, it's going to look a little weird and it's going to take a little bit to get used to, but it's actually a very powerful convention and you'll see it a lot. And we're going to use it multiple times throughout this video just so you get the hang of it. But the idea here is that instead of passing it a variable like a string or an integer as a parameter, we can pass it a function. This is called an anonymous function because it doesn't have a name, and so other code wouldn't be able to execute this function because they don't know what to call it. So we're establishing this anonymous function by using the function keyword here, empty parentheses, and then an opening bracket, and then this ends right here with this closing bracket. But because we're passing it as a parameter, we also need the closing parentheses as well that would go around this method here. So this is the beginning parenthesis, and here's the ending parenthesis. And then this semicolon marks the end of this entire statement. Okay, let's go ahead and save our code, and then jump back to the browser and refresh it, and see what happens. Okay, so we got something this time. It says modules, so I would assume that this heading here would be an H1 tag. I'm going to go ahead and click OK to close it. Before we move on to the next examples, I want to take a minute to introduce you to Firebug. Firebug is a Firefox extension that is a powerful suite of tools for web developers. It includes things like the ability to inspect the DOM in a very granular way, to set breakpoints inside of JavaScript and observe variables and call stacks, and you can see how long various elements are taking to load on the page. And that's just a handful of items. There's a ton that you can do with Firebug. There are a couple of features that we're going to use throughout this video, and I just wanted to point these out to you so that you know what we're doing. If you don't already have Firebug installed, you can get it at getfirebug.com, and you can install it here and then just reload Firefox to enable it. I'm going to jump back to our Drupal site. Now in our previous example, we used a jQuery selector to grab the text from the H1 tag. And I want to find out if this is actually an H1 tag. I can do so by looking at the source code for the page, but that can get a little clunky. So I'm going to right click on it and select Inspect Element. And that will open up this box down at the bottom of the screen with a number of utilities. But what we have here in this main box is the DOM in a hierarchical tree. And then we have the item that we just identified highlighted right here. So we see that it is indeed an H1 tag. And what we can do is hover over this item and it will display with a light blue background at the location where it is in the page. Now if I hover over some other elements, you can see that that light background is changing. Some of the items have purple line and some of them have yellow lines, and these correspond to the margin and the padding on those elements. So we're seeing not only an outline of the element, but some of the properties of it as well, some of the CSS properties. So that can be pretty useful. We can then use this section down here to navigate through the DOM. Now if I scroll up, this is at the very top, and I'm going to scroll down, and that's at the very bottom. You notice that this is very short. The actual source code for this page is going to be a lot longer than that. The reason for that is that most of the elements in this DOM tree are collapsed. So for example, if we wanted to expand this item here, we could click on the arrow, and that would expand it. And we can continue to expand and dig deeper and deeper into the DOM. Now, one way that we're going to use this inspect element feature is to find the CSS properties, well, the CSS class, and the ID for an element. So for example, for this div right here, it has a class of region and a class of region help. The div inside it has an ID of block system help. When it comes to identifying elements for a jQuery selector, the class and the ID tend to be extremely useful in narrowing down the selection. So we're going to talk about how to use the ID and the class as selectors, as well as some other selectors. But if you know where your item is on the page, but you don't quite know how to select it yet with a jQuery selector, you can use the inspect element feature and then find an ID or a class that is assigned to that element, or a parent element, some element that contains it, and use that as your selector. A good convention to be aware of is that the ID tag should be unique for each item. So if you can find an ID tag, then that's a good way to select a very specific item, whereas the class could pertain to multiple items. And so if you're trying to find one particular item, you might have to narrow it down further if you're using a class. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to our next example. I'm going to go ahead and close Firebug here and jump to our module directory.